this architecture and real estate development, has taken on probably what's emerging as one of the most catalytic challenges for the last 50 years of rapid transformation and development, this suburban mall, and has taken a pretty strong and I said in my narrative, optimistic view of repurposing, repositioning the mall in a way that might overcome some of its, let's say, its instability as almost an institution in the suburban landscape. So, Taylor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So again, my name is Taylor Stout, and this thesis is about the 75% of malls that are going to die over the course of our lifetimes. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my committee, Matt Bell, Jana Vandergoot, and Garth Rockcastle for their help over the last year. I want to play a quick video. All of us here have undoubtedly shared the same experience of the mall. The mall is an American institution and part of our cultural heritage. This experience elicits different emotional responses from all of us. For some, it may be joyful remembrance of time spent with loved ones. For others, it's anxiety. One thing is true, malls are in the midst of a national decline. They are so highly specialized, they are unable to adapt to changing demographics and consumer trends, and are becoming relics of an American pastime. Oops. Sorry for this awkward transition. So the title of this thesis is Left for Dead, and it's about re-urbanizing and adapting failing American malls into our urban evolution so that they can better adapt to today's and tomorrow's societal needs. According to CoStar, over 1/5 of the nation's enclosed malls have vacancy rates that are considered to be unhealthy. Many retail experts are predicting that as many as half of American shopping malls, representing millions of square feet of retail space, will fail within the next 15 to 20 years. I believe that this is a critical opportunity and a point in time where we can hypothesize about the future of these shopping malls. But to first understand why the malls are failing, we have to understand why they arose. Malls arose first developed in the 50s and 60s in response to rapid suburbanization. As people flocked from the cities to new and shiny suburbs, the malls naturally followed as a means of feeding and clothing these new suburban populations. Malls were a complete solution to consumer needs, offering products that ranged from groceries to auto supplies to apparel. By the 1970s, malls had become the preferred retail model. Adult Americans spent more time in malls than anywhere else except for home and work. Malls had effectively replaced the downtown square as the third place for the center of community and civic life. Of the 1,500 malls that were built since the 50s, 1,200 remain and 800 are projected to die. This is a result of two main reasons. The first is rapid re-urbanization. For the first time in 70 years, cities are growing at a faster rate than suburbs. The demographics that malls once relied upon are simply not there. The second is the evolution of the retail industry. Malls replaced the urban Main Street as the suburban general store. However, later in the 1970s, commodity retailers crippled department stores and gravely affected the malls. Commodity retailers are big box stores and refers to the goods and services purchased and consumed on a regular basis using primary household funds. This is everyday items such as food and eggs that are purchased, again, on a daily basis. When big box stores separated from the mall, they offered commodity goods at lower prices and at higher convenience, again, crippling the anchor stores and department stores that anchored malls. Later, in the specialty retailers such as theme stores and mixed-use centers emerged, catering to consumers with discretionary time and income. Specialty retail is the idea that people spend their time and money on things that are enjoyable. They enjoy being there. The mall was considered a specialty retail format, but no longer considered such. So in today, the mall is left in a limbo where it's no longer can compete with the aspiration of specialty retail formats, nor can it compete with the commodity and price of the price and convenience of commodity retailers. So the problem is, malls are ill-equipped to adapt to changing demographics and consumer behaviors because they are single-use and isolated. They have resulted in ecological failures, economic vulnerability, and a loss of meaningful public places. My hypothesis is that design thinking can overcome these challenges to create productive, self-sustaining, and adaptable landscapes. As Garth mentioned, this thesis was done in conjunction with my real estate capstone. As part of the dual degree program, I wanted to study malls that were located in areas considered to be highly distressed. These areas qualify for tax advance financing, and malls located in these areas tend to fail at higher rates and are left undeveloped because of the low redevelopment potential. I focused on Marley Station Mall, which is a 1.4 million square foot, two-story super regional mall located in Anne Arundel County. This mall is a little personal to me. I grew up in the area and witnessed its decline firsthand. So in 2012, with high vacancy rates, the north anchor was sold to a data center here. This was just foreshadowing of bigger problems to come, because a year later, Simon defaulted on its loan and the mall was foreclosed upon. Today, the mall still has high vacancy rates, and I believe there's every indication that it will fail in the coming years. Again, the mall is located in Glen Burnie, Maryland, halfway between Annapolis and Baltimore along the Route 2 corridor. Glen Burnie is a less affluent area within an upper income region, and the mall sits really on what I'm calling a demographic fault line between the less affluent areas of southern Baltimore and the high income areas of Annapolis and Severna Park. The area is considered to be heavily distressed. Residents make less than 65% of the area median income, and a large percent of the population is living, or considered to be living in poverty. It's very much blue collar, with most of the wealth concentrated along the waterfront, and it's also a USDA food desert, which prompted me to introduce gardens and a grocery store as part of this proposal. However, the main reason the mall has died has been the competition, primarily due to Annapolis Mall, located 15 miles to the south, and Arundel Mills Mall, which is one of the largest tourist attractions in the state of Maryland, located 9 miles to the east, or excuse me, to the west. Also, the Route 2 corridor is in need of revitalization and is no longer seen as an aspirational retail location, which has led to the decline of the mall. So this is an area of the mall that's existed in its heyday. I focus primarily in the 39.4 acre development parcel. The property is approximately 74 acres. I chose to work primarily in the development parcel because many mall redevelopments are stalled actually by anchor parcels with reciprocal development rights. You may have heard of this at White Flint Mall. By limiting my scope to the development parcel, I hope to avoid interfering with the acre parcels. So typical of most malls is single-use retail. You can see how out of scale it is with the existing urban context and removed. It's located at the intersection of two major highways, in this case US 100 and Route 2. It's surrounded by a sea of surface parking lots and encapsulated by a ring road that accesses Route 2 at 3 separate intersections. It's also at the interface of Marley Creek and the B&A Trail. The B&A Trail is a pedestrian trail that runs all the way from Annapolis to Baltimore. It's paved over the existing Baltimore-Annapolis Railroad. The mall is actually named for the Marley Station stop along the rail line. You can see a view of the mall from the trail here. Marley Creek, as I mentioned before, encompasses the southwest portion of the property. A portion of the creek actually is culverted under the existing surface parking lot. I saw this as a major opportunity moving forward because almost all the surface runoff drains directly into Marley Creek. As a result, the creek is one of the 3 worst or most unhealthy streams in the Baltimore watershed. It's considered to have a very poor status by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and has had a recreational advisory since the 70s due to bacteriological and chemical contamination. You can see from this map, Marley Station is a major point source along of pollutants along that overall watershed. So as a framework for this thesis, I wanted to set certain parameters for myself. The first, again, was to maintain the anchor parcels. The second was to limit new development to what could be sustained by energy produced on-site. I didn't want to think about FAR, but rather a performance metric to limit the density on site. And finally, instead of erasing the history, I wanted to preserve some semblance of the mall on site and preserve the history. To do this, and to come up with a more holistic approach, I analyzed the mall through 4 lenses. The first was the real estate development, followed by urban design, environmental sustainability, and adaptive reuse. My boards are actually laid out in these 4 strategies, and I'll walk you through the rest of the presentation using these lenses. So the first is the real estate solution. The real estate industry has come up with 3 primary solutions to failing malls. The first is simply to abandon the mall, which is to ignore the problem altogether. The second is to introduce new uses to target a new demographic. This strategy does provide a second life for the mall. However, it devalues the property over the course of its lifetime. The third is to raise the mall and redevelop altogether. This strategy fails to harness the embodied energy inherent in the mall and erases all semblance of the past. So, I've concluded that although some important experiments have helped sustain malls, they are mere cosmetic treatments of a malady that needs much deeper diagnostic insight and structurally significant solutions. I'm proposing adaptively reusing portions of the mall. This strategy helps harness some of the embodied energy inherent in the mall and save on capital expenses of new construction. I've introduced new uses, including reducing the retail supply by almost half, provided mixed-use housing, added 2 civic anchors in the form of a school and a new culinary institute, and I hope that this would provide both economic and social diversity. The urban design strategy aims at reintegrating the mall into the urban context. You can see now the mall is disengaged from the surrounding street network. The proposal aims at reconnecting existing thoroughfares, creating multiple points of access along Route 2, and creating a new main street that traverses the entire site. I've also added a new portion of the V&A trail network and a new bus stop to encourage multimodal transportation. The resulting block typology allows for building typologies and densities to change over time. So this is supposed to be a flexible and adaptable space so that we're not dealing with this problem in the next 30 years again. So this is the existing footprint of the mall. You can see my proposal overlaid. The first strategy is introducing a new retail main street that runs perpendicular from Route 2. The retail main street culminates in an urban plaza that is carved out of the existing infrastructure of the mall. Finally, I've uncovered the culverted portion of Marley Creek as part of an environmental strategy, as well as providing an amenity for the new residents that are infilled in the parking lot. As you can see, while the mall was homogeneous, placeless, and disorienting, I've tried to create specific places that help orient visitors through landmarks and help navigate the site. Again, as well as I stated before, reintroducing a portion of the V&A trail through the site and introducing the new bus stop for multimodal transportation. So you can see this is an existing view of the mall looking from Route 2 along the new retail main street, and this is what it could be. This is actually at the intersection or the crossing of the retail main street and the creek walk. I've placed a small tower as a landmark, hopefully branding the development, but also acting as a didactic system for visitors to learn more about the Baltimore watershed. It's a pump station for the new Marley Creek passive system of stormwater treatment. This is a view of the ring road looking at the surface parking lot. Underneath us is the culverted portion of Marley Creek. By uncovering a portion of the creek, I hope to create an amenity space as well as adding to the V&A trail network. Finally, this is the existing plaza internal to the mall. My strategy is daylighting the plaza and creating a new civic heart for the community. So, Marley Creek is critical to the environmental strategy. By unearthing the creek, I have reduced impervious surface on site and created a new green corridor and catchment area for stormwater runoff. This is a diagram about the passive system that treats runoff of PCBs and heavy metals from the surface parking lots. The Marley Creek system runs throughout the site. It begins with nutrient removal and heavy metal removal using hydroaccumulators and bioremediators, which are plants that take out some of these pollutants. It then narrows to a more urban creek walk that uses weirs as a system of aeration and oxygenation for the water. And finally ends with sand filtration in a catchment area before being released into Marley Creek. I think this system will significantly reduce the pollutants entering Marley Creek and Marley Station as a point source of pollutants. Again, the environmental strategy was also reducing density based off of how much energy I could produce on site. I devoted over a third of the site to energy production in the form of photovoltaics and geothermal wells. The photovoltaics are arranged along the existing surface parking lots in the form of carports, as well as introducing bioswales and permeable pavers into the new parking lots. Finally, the adaptive reuse lens. Malls are very much inward looking. People enter these giant blank facades through tiny entrances. Shoppers enter this internalized street network that is confusing, disorienting, and intentionally confuses a sense of time and place. Small courtyards offer moments of reprieve. These spaces are characterized by people watching and assimilating to society. However, because the mall is so carefully choreographed and limiting of expression, these spaces lack the character of truly meaningful public places. I hope to reverse this trend by externalizing a portion of the mall and turning the mall inside out. Effectively trying to activate all of these facades and creating a flexible space where there could be food trucks and farmers markets, outdoor movie theater, a culmination of outdoor cafe, a culinary institute, a bus stop, a brewery, and apartments to keep eyes on the new plaza at all times. This space is supposed to be a real cross-section of what an urban downtown would look like. And finally, the adaptive reuse strategy looks at preserving the history of the mall and actually highlighting the passing of time. Columns are left embedded in the new plaza and are actually allowed to decay. The concrete decays and the steel is allowed to rust. The trusses that existed at the top of the mall are an interactive element where people can sit. The existing mall footprint is outlined in the paving pattern, and a portion of the B&A trail rail line is unearthed and incorporated in part of that paving pattern. Finally, I've actually allowed grass to grow selectively in these areas, cracking the concrete paving. I think this is a beautiful memory of what has been there and what could be. So again, there's also a new elevator tower that is an icon for the development and harkens back to the elevator, which was the hearth of this mall. And it's supposed to be an icon that helps navigate throughout the entire site. So, in contradiction to most malls, this site is supposed to be designed and tied specifically to Marley Station to encourage a sense of discovery and exploration. Finally, in conclusion, of the nearly 800 malls that will die, there are nearly 800 malls that will die in the coming years. Malls are in the midst of a national decline, there's no doubting that. I hope to create a formulaic approach to reintegrating and adapting malls to our changing societal needs. By using the 4 lenses, I try to create a holistic approach to these complex issues that would yield a more thoughtful response in order so that the spaces can be adaptable so that architects don't have to think about this problem in the next 30 years. With that, I'd like to open it up to any questions. Thank you, and move to the boards.
I have a question.
Yeah.
One of your early analysis was the transformation of Main Street into replacement of Main Street into these malls. I don't really know from your discussion where the old center of town used to be in this area, but what is your position about the mall and its future and the derelict urban centers? This is the mall. I think you used the word urban. It's not urban at all. It's suburban. Here, you're taking a position that by all means, let's save them all. What is your position in relationship to the decayed and the kind of abandoned and derelict downtowns that are currently populating our country?
I believe by no means these should replace the downtowns. I think downtowns deserve their own.
Well, it's more a question of maybe funding or energy and effort. And that would be a follow-up question. You ran your business model?
I did.
And for all of this transformation, construction, infrastructure, you're just betting that Macy's can come back and pay for it?
It did produce reasonable returns. I actually went into this not thinking I would have to play with this much density, but because of pro forma, I added the density you see here to the site. I needed more residential units to attract investors. But what you're saying is I don't believe that malls should replace downtowns. I think this could just be a pocket or a corridor of density along these suburban networks. And I believe that they are one of the greatest potentials for suburban infill that we have today.
Thanks for that answer. I want to say that this is a very real problem that we're all facing here in this day and age that we're living here in the U.S. And we do see some of these malls decaying. And I appreciate that you took this problem hard on and made it into a thesis. It's a fascinating. Your approach, in my mind, is fascinating because it actually deals with the place and it doesn't try to make it something else that it isn't. Also, you want to preserve parts of the mall because of some romantic memory that you had with the mall, and so you assume that part of the community, this became part of the culture too, part of the community. But at the same time, it's not a viable economic enterprise. And so you try to bring that back, and without doing any of those three options that you showed up earlier, correct? The complete demolition or restructuring the economic model of the mall by different tenants and all those things. So opening up a street, opening up to daylight, bringing mixed-use development around it, having a sustainable approach to the creek that's polluted, having a way to unpollute it, have a way to deal with all these issues in one swoop. I think it's very commendable and fascinating, and probably a model that's going to be emulated in many places for real in this country. And it's not downtown, it's not a city, but suburbia is there, and there's a lot of these populations, as you said earlier. I mean, some of them are depressed areas that do need new catalysts, and this could be it. I remember living in downtown Silver Spring before it became what it is today, and frankly, it was a commercial venture that turned that upside down. And all that mixed-use development, all that came to that area, was because somebody had a vision similar to this one. So I commend you, and thank you very much. Great presentation.
I don't think there's a downtown anywhere near.
Downtown is located roughly 2 miles north along Route 2, but they've actually been trying. Downtown Glen Burnie.
Yeah, such as it is.
It's not really quite a downtown. They've been trying to turn it into a mixed-use town center.
I think there's courage in taking something like this instead of saying, we're going to bulldoze everything, plant trees, and move everyone to downtown. I mean, this is a place too. This is a place that already has memory. He has already memories in this place, but it's not viable, and I think it's commendable that you're facing it and you're saying, you know what, we're going to develop this thing, we're going to change its model. So it's very interesting.
Remarkable to be talking about preserving the history of the mall. and I think there's more to be done. I think you could, in terms of how that could be expressed in a meaningful architectural way. I think it's more than fragments. It's more than parts and pieces. But a couple of the gestures here are about undoing some thoughtless deeds from the past. Daylighting this creek, is a little bit, is a terrific restorative idea that could be the brand, could be the thing that makes this identifiable and successful and gives it a sense of place. It's a little bit like, feels a little bit like areas of Detroit where old urban neighborhoods are now turned back to farmland. Where there's this transformation that's taken a couple steps back to something that's perhaps a little healthier and a little more balanced. But I think there's a good deal more to be developed here to convince me, for instance, that these exactly what the character of this housing is, exactly what the character of this environment is. And you talked about your block evolution and some of those pieces there. I'm not fully convinced yet that the composition of those things and and their arrangement is developed enough to convey what that place would be like in a real sort of unified composition with some of the thoughtful gestures around the mall, like creating the sort of the public court.
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit because I think it's a really important conversation. I'll say that I really absolutely do appreciate the attention to this condition. I had no idea there was only 1,200 malls in America. It really, I would assume there would be many more than that.
The super regional malls.
Super regional malls. But I think it is a prototype, a typology that is transforming drastically, and what do we do about it? So I think engaging the topic is fantastic. I also really appreciate your initial gestures, that as if I'm reading it correctly, I think I am, of moving from a hermetically sealed environment to a much more porous environment where and I think maybe limiting yourself to only one piece of the pie, of the real estate pie, maybe was a bit of you might have been more ambitious or said, okay, I'm going to now, because it's a thesis project, I'm going to speculate, I'm going to look at this as an object in 360 degrees. But the notion that you would, I think one of the big issues is the fact that it's such a sealed environment. At the same time, one of its incredible attractions is the fact that one can curate and create an incredible environment that is completely removed from the exterior. So you're, I think, on one hand, kind of two-edged sword. You're opening it up to its context and making it much more porous, so there's less barriers. On the other hand, you're maybe kind of, again, trying to simulate a small town, and that was where my question was going. You're trying to recreate Main Street, the main square, and so on, and 2 miles away we have another that's already right there. So maybe that might not be, there might be other strategies that you would employ. And I guess, so that's where my critique begins to come into it. What else might the mall be? It's a shell. It's, your scenario suggests it's completely vacated. It's a relic. It's an archaeological site. Maybe not in terms of physical, detritus. I don't know if the truss is the Roman column that we might unearth and hold. Really, but it's sort of tongue-in-cheek. I think it should be. But what else can the mall be as a kind of this massive amount of real estate that might, in fact, bring equal employment to the area, maybe it's not, and perhaps might bring citizens back into that area, but how might it, not just the program, it might use the kind of this field of unending space, windowless world. How does one begin to occupy it, reimagine it? And I'm not going to give you a suggestion. It could be startup companies. It could be anything related to the area. It could be eco-environmental recycling centers. It could be, it could be commercial again. But I guess that's where my critique is going to come in a little bit because of the location of the town. So I think it could do everything that you're doing. But I have to say I'm really highly problematic with the images and the renderings. It's maintaining a kind of incredible commercial culture. It's, I think, very middle class, homogenous. When it's not going to, I don't know what the area around it is. You said it was a quite economically depressed area. I can't imagine a skate park there, or bicycles coming through, or rock concerts, or the appropriation of some of the programming that we've seen the last couple of days about the digital spaces that we might be creating, the intersections. So it seems to me a really, and you can all beat me up on this, a very retroactive, trying to bring back a kind of 80s culture, gentrification, very segregated environment. And I feel like, so everything you've done I think is fantastic, but I just think you should really be aware of the sort of stereotypes that you're precipitating, and maybe at a thesis one might challenge those a little bit, and so that's my 2 cents.
Well, I think you got to respond to some of that.
So I did. Okay. To start the
Just pick
process.
one.
Yeah. Okay. To wrap my head around this, when I was first doing the site design, I did look at different urban theories. I didn't expect this to turn out as a commercial center. I looked at what would Bernard Schumi do this as an event city. I looked at what would lean urbanism do here. I looked at what would be an infrastructural or ecological urbanistic approach. And this was mainly dealing with the creek walk and reconnecting patches, and there was not nearly the density or the uses there, but this is also a real estate thesis, and at some point I had to come up with the numbers, and that's how I think I stumbled into this new commercial center and this new civic heart of really contrasting downtown Glen Burnie. So I guess that would be my response is, There was an initial investigation, and I don't think this is the solution for every single mall, but this is kind of what I fell into at this location.
Just to add on to that, earlier on in your analysis, one of the things that emerged, and you don't have the drawings of it up here, is that in this area of Anne Arundel County, there's almost nothing walkable within miles. And even downtown Glen Burnie, downtown in quotes, ain't all that shit hot. I mean, it's not great. It's a crummy place. No, but one of the things he did early on was to look at the fact that those things, this is, you call it a food desert, it's a walkable desert. I mean, the post-World War II suburbs were really the things that were built out here, oriented towards the automobile, and you really can't walk anywhere. Even 2 miles, you say Glen Burnie's close to 2 miles, that's not even that walkable either. It's a little block or two there. So it doesn't, it would have been helpful at least to have that in your hip pocket as a kind of analysis, because you did do that earlier. And one of the things he did was he looked at other mall sites and picked this one later on because it had more of those kind of characteristics he wanted to address.
Another of the challenges associated with going to someplace like Glen Burnie, where I've never been, I proudly say that. I've lived in Maryland for nearly 30 years and never been there. But I would imagine if it's anything like College Park, that there's a lot of different land ownership. And one of the opportunities here is the fact that this is potentially one big or some assembled parcels that can be easily negotiated. One of the things that has retarded growth in College Park for so long is the fact that there are landowners that have held out against bigger development.
I think, for one, I applaud you for looking at a problem that our society is going to have to deal with, and I'm glad there are people like you that have an interest and are willing to tackle those big problems. I think in some ways this suffers from the same issue that we had with Krishna's thesis earlier on. In your own definition, because you're tackling such a big thing, it was the way you set those parameters very early on, that she set the parameters in her way and kind of bought into those things. I think here, to me, the problem with the mall, and you alluded to it in your opening statements there, is the anchor stores. That the anchor store model doesn't work anymore. Everything's attacked that, and the whole mall thing was basically this anchor store. So that you've put the anchor stores out of bounds, and you have a mall here that has one of the answers here, right? It becomes an employment center. So the data center, it's not a huge employment center. It's one very light footprint as far as employment. But if we imagine that it's the anchors that go away, and it's the small shops in the center that actually could stay retail. But part of this, like we have with Krishna, where she kept the long walk from the curb to the gate, you've kind of bought into, again, maybe it's part of it, that's all you know because that's all you've seen, even though you're trying to test and find a novel approach. In the end, you've just given us a slightly downsized mall with, again, a little bit of interior-exterior inversion. But because of the way you defined it and putting those anchor stores out, if you would come back and say, okay, the anchor stores are all going to be employment centers, and this one's going to have 100 employees, this one's going to have 50 employees, this one's going to have 45 employees, and that's who's going to live here. I mean, I'm constantly amazed when I do see mall developments, they put housing around the edge of the parking lot. Who the hell are these people who want to live in a parking lot? But they do, and it's developers that keep putting them there because someone's buying it. But to me, if we don't flip that anchor store into an employment center that's going to do something else, to me, you've just you've just rescaled the mall and you've given me a nostalgic view of the 80s. And it'll be another Mallrats movie to kind of show us how people live in this fantasy land. So there's a fantasy quality to it. And I just want to challenge you that maybe came from your initial definition. I understand why you defined it that way and put the anchor stores out of bounds, but, you know.
In response to that, I don't see this actually as the final build out. I didn't quite get to that stage. This would be the first solution to the problem. At some point, I imagine the anchor stores dissolving and a continuation of the street network through the site. Unfortunately, I don't have a graphic showing that, but I don't imagine those anchor spots being there forever. I can imagine, again, them dissolving as time passes. But again, I have given some of the space to, originally this was going to be a community center. This was going to be part of the data center, coming down into the mall and creating a bigger employment hub. I just didn't quite progress the thesis in that way.
Well, I think it bears saying something you talked about with the committee early on, which I think is worth underscoring that maybe didn't come out in the presentation, is that anchor stores in the mall have different lease arrangements. And oftentimes the anchors own the land that they sit on. And the mall developer sells them the land and builds the stuff around it. So what happens is the malls become very difficult to redevelop because the anchors are there and you have to leave them. Sometimes they're there on 30, 40, 50-year land leases. And this has been one of the major problems in redeveloping Landmark Mall and redeveloping White Flint Mall and these things. So they're sitting there, and whatever we imagine them to be, it's fun to imagine that they could be different things. But I think one of the things the committee was interested in the dialogue with Taylor, was the real problem here is you have to assume at some level, because of the way this is playing out in the real estate industry, that the anchors stay, that they're going to be there because they have been.
I thought, just to clarify, I thought the argument was that all the anchors are actually leaving because of becoming standalone.
Well,
this was a vacant.
Do you want to elaborate on
I
that?
just was, this must be.
Like you, he doesn't need that.
So all the anchors are actually still there except for the data center.
How are they making money if nobody's going, if it's going to fail?
No, so roughly 20% of the mall, this north wing, is all vacant currently. So the mall is operating as a mall today. I'm projecting that again in 15 to 20 years it will die. People are still using the mall.
So just my question, when it dies, what happens to, okay, so say.
There have been malls where.
owns that, but
yeah.
they're no longer in it. Do they just, do they have an interest to move back in once if something happens, or would they just rent it out to another tenant? I guess is the question. I mean, to take it seriously, right?
Yeah, so basically mall owners just seal these, or the anchor owners seal this entrance, and it becomes a standalone big box store. And some of the interior mall is left programmed, but it's all concentrated in one area, and the left will be vacated.
I think it depends, because if the area succeeds, they will want to continue to be there. And you know, if that becomes a catalyst for bringing people, activity, jobs, you know, amenities, I think there is a cultural element that's probably missing. You're probably missing a library. You're probably missing schools. Probably missing other. Oh, there's a school. Okay. Okay. I see a field there, a soccer field. But I was envisioning this a possible step one of a phased project that could succeed or could not. You know, it depends. It depends on what kind of retail is brought in there. I see that you're showing Target and the Wegmans and things like that, which, you know, are retail establishments that are succeeding in these deserts of pedestrian that are not friendly for people to walk around. These things are succeeding in actually bringing people back, and you are creating an area that people can actually walk around and so forth. So, for better or for worse, I mean, we talked in other theses about, you know, empathy to human beings. It's very interesting when we're talking about Mumbai and other areas. I mean, this is also, we need to have empathy here too. This exists. It is a problem, and this is, for better or for worse, an architectural solution. We may not like the 80s look of the thing. We may not like exactly the way it's keeping the anchors, but you know what? This is a reality, and takes courage to actually take something like this and try to make it a thesis out of it. So.
Let me just one more, put it maybe another way. So that's the scenario that it's abandoned, right? It's dead, it's gone. I mean, it's all there. So here you've added a lot of, I think, really important programs, housing, or things that might bring some 24-hour occupation of the place, but I think it's obviously one of the problems of the mall. Other people have vested interest in it, the community, whether it's libraries or schools. But you know, maybe the kind of housing one brings here might be, in a way, interpreted within the shell of the existing mall. So what happens when you turn Macy's big box into housing? Like, how can one do that? How is that as a problem? So we're recycling the structures, but the housing becomes changed as a function of the prototype that we've begun with, right? So it just seems to me that I mean, I completely agree with the ambition. I'm just wondering I don't think it's just a question of just reprogramming it. You know, I think it's really dealing with the physicality of the place, because ultimately in all of this, what I see as your major interest and initiative, which I think is fantastic, is this sort of the ecological one, the ecological piece. whether it's the slow food movement, or whether it's sort of the kind of, kind of cleaning the landscape, or whether it's creating kind of a visual kind of culture there of primitive landscapes and of unearthing what's been hidden and calling attention to the environment. I think that somehow seems to be the main focus, and what you think is a failure of this mall. The parking and the boxes and the interior and the commercialization, and that's. So I'm just would encourage you to really focus on give it a direction that maybe is not trying to recreate something else, but it's trying to sort of take it forward.
Sure.
I think the one mall that probably shouldn't have been torn down was Northland by Victor Gruen in Detroit, which is the first mall. And so it's interesting, which just happened this past year. So I don't know if you spent any time studying that. Did you look at it?
I studied Victor Gruen, but not specifically that mall.
Okay, well that was the first mall, right? And he actually creates these kind of gardens inside and colorful skylights and thin columns and trying to think about that relationship between the two. What I appreciate about your project is, and I go back to Detroit and the comment of people sort of flipping it by starting to cultivate part of the landscape, sort of accepting that perhaps the population isn't going to come back, so that there's the next wave is going to happen here. And so the work that you did with the daylighting the stream, showing the area around as green, what I would love to see is for you to create a plan that shows how this project would develop over time. And so if you had those, maybe you have those sketches somewhere, but to push, because it seems you have the start of that idea, so even if you didn't develop that further, to show how this interest in sustainability in a lot of different ways, the question of ecology, the retransformation, of the land itself into a different kind of productivity and what its effects are on that center, I think would push your idea, to a fuller a kind of vision that could then be emulated in other places. Thanks.
This is really one of the more fascinating conversations, mostly because as a thesis student, at least my view mostly, because as a thesis student, you're put in a framework and a set of expectations about a thesis manifest as a project proposition, polished and delivered as a completed state, in a completed state. And I'm peeling back the memories of your early research phase and reminded of the richness of these what you're calling toolkits here, the urban theory toolkits, and then actually applying them to this context and envisioning almost everything that's already just been mentioned as a working hypothesis, but feeling the anxiety and the structure of our curriculum and expectations of thesis. All right, buddy, choose one, ride that pony to the finish line, and we'll be the judges of whether you got the stuff. And so I've oversimplified it a little bit, but there's an element of that here that I think may be cause for us to step back and say perhaps theses, rich theses, could be more an elaboration on those and layering fiscal modeling and hypotheses on top of it, and we have a family of scenarios, and that the idea of design agency, to borrow terms from the other side of this board, could be thought of and advocated more in the form of processes where design thinking could aid economic modeling and community engagement and debate. It's finally, for me, quite remarkable that the thread that stands here, I think, most affirming and exciting is this ecological thread, because I don't recall it being in the mix when you first started, and it got uncovered, if you will, and it kept getting momentum. And the more you looked at the ecological factors that this interstate was one of them, and its watershed deposits into the watershed were one of the biggest problems. And so you actually got outside the project original definition and address something that becomes potentially the real lifeline of this, and I think would warrant some desire to be affiliated with for housing, recreation, schools, learning programs, etc. And I can imagine the mall disappearing and that piece still making sense and living beyond in another alternative branch of this. But I do think that our disciplines, and I so appreciate this about this thesis and your work on it, because you went in and interrogated the failures of these things, drew out the proper kind of appraisal of those causes, and forged forward to think about how to model economically. A few of the projects that I've had the good fortune to work on didn't model out economically when they were first considered. It wasn't until they were envisioned and there was some evidence in a responsive market that made sense. And there's been comments made about the detritus of these mall fragments. I agree that you've scratched that surface and opened it up. But I would argue the reverse, that it's some of the archaeological of this remaining and layering of history, despite its origin as a, let's say, less than glamorous original artifact, that is some of the most powerful potential. And it is our ability to reframe, remake, reposition, play with this detritus that actually is a source of great expression, significance, and design thinking. So, yeah, that's a lot of bundle of stuff. But I wanted to kind of weave the salad into the meal here a little bit and understand some of the complexity that's here and some of the work you did, because I felt we were drifting off and actually, let's say, questioning ourselves in the cloak of thesis that we more or less brought to the table for this work.
So I really enjoyed working with you on this thesis project, and I learned a lot about doing a pro forma and the real estate side of things. So I want to thank you for bringing that to the table for me. I just want to make a quick comment about. I actually think there's more to your research than this conversation recognized, and I'm going to look at these diagrams, and specifically the last two diagrams that represent 2030 and 2040. They are urban views of what might happen to the mall, so mall cannibalization and mall redevelopment. And actually that last image starts to look a lot like this, right? You're breaking it down into almost a kind of new downtown. And I think these diagrams as well start to set up a new basis for urbanism, right? And so I can see some landscape ecological urbanism moves here where you're actually thinking about the potential future of a parking lot as a green space, right? You can imagine all of the parking lots turning into this, using that strategy to crack the concrete. And also, I think you do have an urban strategy for future access, right, and for creating the network and the nodes and the bike trails. So while you didn't necessarily go into the individual anchor buildings and reimagine what those could be, I think you did start to set up an urban strategy for the future, and so I want to commend you on that and just point us to that kind of small diagram in the presentation. Thanks, Taylor.
Thank you.
Okay, Meyer Chair. Taylor is a real pleasure to work with. He has a tremendous work ethic, and what I have totally appreciate about working with him is his constant visiting of the constraints. And I think his constraints are interesting in the sense that, every time we sort of poked at the mall, he would say, well, this is what I know about it, and I think this is the model. Or, he's got a lot of experience working in the sort of developer world of the kind of housing that gets built in this region, and he wanted to maintain that as a kind of constraint as well, partly because I think his assumption in this site was that this world is a world that gets passed by, because if there was higher land value and higher income, the mall would have been torn down a long time ago and something would have happened. And I think this gets back to the business of the one thesis type, which is there's something wrong with my hometown, and the idea being that if you can make a walkable place here, and deal with it in an economic model which is not the very wealthy Montgomery County suburbs or Northern Virginia, but something that is much more middle class. And you can introduce the typologies that don't require structured parking, that don't require great movements of the earth to make them happen. You can actually make a model that could reasonably suppose to deal with the problem of these things. And that's what I appreciate very much about the thesis, which is the constraints that you set for yourself. I think one point that didn't get said very emphatically that ought to have been said is that when you can make a walkable environment like this, you can reduce people's carbon footprint. I mean, this is a significant achievement, whether you mess with the mall enough or not for some people's take, to make this a walkable environment that connects neighborhoods or even connects public spaces as a result, either the creek or the spaces on either side, reduces people's carbon footprint. And it's kind of ironic that you could go and take a mall site and redevelop it into something that could have that level of an economic benefit. I think as well, one of the things I've appreciated very much about Taylor is the rigor of his research, and I think Jana mentioned, I just want to underscore it, his analysis of retail and his interest in it and the relationship between how that world works and the sort of constraints that world forces on us versus what one might do in a design world when we know less about retail, we know more about retail, was an interesting dialectic in the thesis process. And I think that's one of the great benefits of having people who do both the master's degree in architecture and the master's degree in real estate development, because they bring both that interest and that insight. To me, I think the project is really about these two sheets right here. It's really about the environmental recovery. It's really about the placemaking, and whether there's a mall over here or not, I think this is very well crafted and very well thought out, and a very simple diagram, and does a great deal in terms of mixing housing types and therefore mixing people in different stages of life living there, all woven through by the thread of this new landscape opportunity, which I think is a significant thing, whether the mall's there in the future or not. So thank you for bringing this project to us, Taylor, and I congratulate you.